Yeah, I got it.
So today we're going to talk about the Black Panther Party. And so originally it was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. It was founded in 1966 in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area, by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, two activists that met at Merritt College. And they were part of activism on campus, and they were part of multiple student groups, but their continuous dissatisfaction with each of these groups was what they saw as an inability to combat police brutality in Oakland. And that was kind of the core of this movement, was combating police brutality. And specifically, this was done by leaning on laws in California at the time that allowed citizens to openly carry loaded guns. And so originally, like, the big course of action was to form these patrols of Black activists that would follow Oakland police, essentially, and monitor their activities, which is a big part of the controversy surrounding the Black Panthers. So there was also a big focus on, like, imbalance in politics, like having communities that were populated by a lot of non-white people, but not having representation within those systems. And they leaned really heavily on Marxist ideology, as well as thoughts from Malcolm X. And there's kind of a complicated relationship between Black Panther ideology and communism that we'll talk about a little bit later. So at the peak of the Black Panther Party, there were over 2,000 members. They've had 40 chapters, and activism kind of declined through the 70s and more or less officially ended in the 80s. And a big part of this is kind of the FBI's mission to squash this movement. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at the time, identified the Black Panthers as what he thought was the greatest internal threat to the country.
Oh, this is their 10-point program. This outlines exactly what the Black Panthers wanted as a movement. Freedom, full employment, end of robbery by the capitalists, decent housing, education, and the biggest one was an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of Black people. They were also concerned about incarceration of Black people, especially when it was done systemically as a form of racism. And they wanted what a lot of people in civil rights movements want: land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And they pulled a lot of these points directly from the Constitution itself. And they constantly referred back to this 10-point program. I'm going to talk about the movement leaders. In the top left-hand corner, that's Huey Newton. That's one of the more popular pictures that's more recently been circulated a lot because of the Black Panther movie, which I'll talk about later. But Huey Newton, and Bobby Seale is directly below him with his fist raised. Huey Newton, I think an interesting thing about him is that he graduated from high school not being able to read. He then taught himself how to read before going and moving on to college, where he met Bobby Seale, and they started the Black Panthers. Huey Newton is kind of described as a very passionate leader, but someone who wasn't necessarily stable. And people within the party themselves describe him as that. A year after creating the Black Panther Party in 1967, he was charged with voluntary manslaughter in the death of a police officer, and he was then imprisoned for the next 22 months. Huey's incarceration and the want for him to be released from prison became a huge cornerstone of the Black Panther movement and something that they protested a lot about. Free Huey was a slogan that was used a lot throughout the movement. When he was released, he continued to work as a leader in the Black Panther Party until 1974, when he was accused of another murder. This time, he fled to Cuba for the next 3 years, and his time in Cuba really influenced his political strategies. And when he came back to the United States, the communism in Cuba was something that it seemed like it had influenced him a lot. When he returned to face the charges, it was a hung jury, so he never had to serve prison for that. Huey Newton was one of the last leaders in the Black Panther Party to continue to act as a leader, but towards the end of his time as the leader, a lot of people within the movement had a lot of issues with the strategies that he used. It seemed almost as if he had accepted the label of criminal that had been given to him by the FBI. He started working with some people who weren't necessarily on the up and up in Oakland, and trying to work with what he saw as the underbelly of society. And as more and more people left the Black Panther Party, he just became more and more closed off. In 1989, in August, he was found shot dead in Oakland. And yeah, Bobby Seale was seen more as a philosopher for the movement. He kind of had the ideological background for the Black Panthers. In 1970, he was one of the 8 people who were brought up on charges in Chicago called the Chicago 8 and then the Chicago 7. Basically, these were a bunch of assault charges that were brought up against Black Panther Party members in Chicago, and they were all tried together except for Bobby Seale. His trial was separate, and during the trial, he was bound and gagged, chained to his chair. He tried to represent himself because his lawyer was ill, and when he tried to do this, the judge, Julius Hoffman, demanded that he be bound and gagged. It was like torture happening in the trial room, and the people who saw what was happening, it definitely angered them, and it made them see that the justice system was not going to listen to the Black Panthers at all, and even would torture them. He served 4 years in prison for contempt of court as a result of this trial, which is almost more shocking. One of the last things that the Black Panther Party did as an entire movement was they had him run for mayor of Oakland in 1973. They were trying to consolidate all of their forces, brought them back to Oakland, and then had him run for mayor. He lost, and this was one of the last times that the Black Panthers tried to have a large-scale political activism moment. But he's still alive, I believe. Yes. Then we have Eldridge Cleaver, who's up top there. Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, were in the media a lot, representing the Black Panther movement. Oh, wait, I might have messed that up. Nope, I did it right. But one of the things that Eldridge Cleaver did that really stands out in his leadership of the Black Panther Party was in 1968, right after MLK was assassinated. A lot of people in the Black Panther Party movement felt like they needed to do something to continue their position as the vanguard of the revolution, especially in light of the violence. So what Cleaver decided to do was attack the police directly. He and a few other people, including a 17-year-old boy named Bobby Hurton, shot at the police and in the subsequent firefight, he was injured. When they surrendered, Bobby Hurden came out with his shirt off, hands in the air, trying to show that he was unarmed, and he was shot and killed by police. This was the first fatality within the Black Panther movement, and it really hit the movement very, very hard because it was such a young person to die, and a lot of people in the movement knew that attacking the police directly would be suicide, and he faced a lot of criticism for doing this. He fled the United States to go to Algeria after this shooting instead of facing charges, and here he opened an international section of the Black Panther Party that was extremely successful. They were able to create international relations with people from Vietnam, China, and North Korea. This was a dream that people like Malcolm X and other Black political leaders had been having for a while, to have international relations, and Eldridge Cleaver was able to start to create some of those relationships. Another smaller figure is Stokely Carmichael. He kind of came up with a lot of the terminology that we think of when we think of Black Panthers, like Black Power and Black is Beautiful. He's a very good rhetorical speaker, but perhaps one of the best rhetorical speakers in the movement was Fred Hampton. I'm going to play a short speech from him.
I want you to know that I want you to see. If you ever think about me, and if you think about me niggas and you ain't gonna do no revolutionary action, forget about me. I don't want myself on your mind if you're not gonna work with me. Like we always did, if you actually make a commitment at the age of 20, and you say, I don't want to make that commitment, because of the simple reason that I'm too young to die, I want to live a little bit longer. What you did, you did already. You have to understand that people have to pay the price for peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then goddamn it, you don't deserve to win. Let me say it to you, you win like that. Let me say it to you, you liberation. I've been gone for a while. You my body, don't you gotta be like me. My body been gone for a while. But I'm back now, and I'm leaving back to me. I believe that I'm going to do my job. I believe that I was born not to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die because no one died. I don't believe I'm going to die because I got a bad heart. I don't believe I'm going to die because of lung cancer. I believe that I'm going to be able to die what I was just the thing that I was born for. I believe that I'm going to be able to die off these people. I believe that I will be able to die as a revolutionary against that national revolutionary struggle. And I hope that each one of you will be die in that national revolutionary struggle and be living. And I think that struggle is going to come. One of our heroes, one of our struggles, one of our die.
So Fred Hampton, when we talk about COINTELPRO, which was the FBI agency set up to dismantle the Black Panthers, one of their main goals was to stop the rise of a Black Messiah figure. And a lot of people within the Black Panther Party said that Fred Hampton might have been that Black Messiah figure. He was extremely influential. The first time he spoke, he was 20 years old. He was at the trial for Bobby Seale, and he came out and he talked to everyone. Here he said, you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail a revolution. People were just kind of hooked on his rhetoric and found him very compelling. Another thing he was popular for was he would do a call and response of I am a revolutionary, where he would say that, then the crowd would say it, and it really got a sense of togetherness for the people there. Something that made him really effective was that he had a broad-based appeal. He had worked for the NAACP from the time that he was 17, and so he knew some of the older Black civil rights activists. He brought them into the fold, as well as the younger ones. But he also reached out to Latino and white communities within Chicago and other areas, and really tried to create an intersectional base for the Black Panther Party, and that was one of the reasons why the FBI was so frightened of him. The FBI planted an informant as Fred's personal bodyguard. He gave them all the information. He gave the FBI all the information of the layout of the headquarters that Fred was staying at. Then in 1969, the FBI planned an assassination where they went to the place where he was staying at. Fred Hampton was asleep at the time with his wife, who was 8 months pregnant. They came into the house and shot a ton of times. The amount of times that the police shot into the building was just incredible, and killed Fred Hampton. On TV, they recreated the scene, but they left the crime scene open, so people came in and saw the devastation to the building, saw the fact that there was a blood stain that went from Fred Hampton's bed all the way to the front room where he was finally shot for the final time. And they were also able to confirm that there had only been one Black Panther bullet fired in the building by the young man who opened the door, who was shot immediately as he opened the door, and as he was falling and dead, his gun fired. So it was just very intense to look at that scene because it just shows how much force they used to kill.
Alright, so we briefly touched on the ideology in a couple of slides, but I thought it was important to go more deeply into it. So like we talked about it, they do have a very anti-capitalist ideology. This was really born from after World War II when there's a lot of poverty, a lot of residential segregation. Now, it is important to note here that there was the Oakland chapter, which was the main chapter, but like we said, there were 40 other chapters. And so while this ideology was fairly constant among them, there were some differences. This is primarily the Oakland chapter and from the beginning. So in line with the anti-capitalist ideology was the community structure. They really believed that the community was going to be the one who raised the community up. They did this through several different programs, one of which was the police patrol, in which they actually went and patrolled the police to make sure they were behaving properly in their communities. I included a quote by Max Weber here: "A state is a human community that claims the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force within a given territory." So what he's saying here is that the state has monopoly on violence, and this is very much in line with what the Black Panther thought, and so they were reclaiming that violence. They also had a very hyper-masculine image, which caused a lot of problems within the group members. James Baldwin, that quote on there, he was known to be affiliated with the Black Panthers, but the Black Panthers definitely distanced themselves from him because of his sexuality. Additionally, they saw America as a fascist nation, and they defined fascism as capitalism plus racism. They used several recruitment strategies. One was to reach out to the lumpen proletariat, which is a Marxist term that Marx uses. The lumpen proletariat are criminals, gang members, basically the underclass of society. And so Huey Newton really relied on those types of people to bring the community up. They also recruited at colleges and universities. One way that they did that was selling Mao's Red Book, which is a bunch of quotes about communism to college students. And with the funds from selling that Red Book, they would purchase shotguns to go police patrol. So with the hypermasculinity comes issues with women, right? And so Angela Davis was one of the leaders in the Black Panther Party, and she said, to understand how any society functions, you must understand the relationship between the men and the women. And that relationship was fairly complicated throughout the whole history. As you know, Black women have double jeopardy. They are oppressed for both their race and their gender. So they kind of came to the Black Panther Party in hopes of relieving both of those things. The Black Panther Party is known in popular media for discrimination against women, but that doesn't necessarily capture the whole truth of what was actually happening. So in 1968, that was fairly consistent. They did limit women's involvement in the party. In some of their literature, they said that Black women are meant to stand behind Black men and support them. That quickly changed in 1969. They put out literature that said sexism is counter-revolutionary, and that it will end, and that we will basically punish anyone who is being sexist. But throughout, they did see race as more oppressive than gender, and so they definitely tried to keep a focus on race rather than gender. And like I said earlier, the Black Panther Party did provide more opportunities for activism than any other group that was currently going on right at this moment. But it was very much dependent on location. So in Oakland, it was very much women were limited from leadership roles, but in other areas like Des Moines and New Haven, those chapters were headed by women. So it definitely depended on where you were. And one of the things that women in the Black Panther Party used as resistance was beauty standards. So for the first time in quite a long time, they wore natural hair. They, believed that having darker skin is beautiful. And so they very much, as you can see from their pictures, they very much relied on their natural beauty standards rather than white beauty standards. So this is an interview with Angela Davis while she was incarcerated, kind of detailing the ideology of the group and kind of some gender stuff too.
A year ago, the Black Panthers were much more active, much more about that type of struggle. This is the time when the Black Panthers passed.
The Black Panthers still exist, and the Black Panthers are still extremely active in the Oakland community and in communities all over the country. I'm not sure whether you are aware of what is now happening in the Black Panther Party, the kinds of things that members of that party are doing now. First of all, if you're going to talk about a revolutionary situation, you have to have people who are physically able to wage revolution, who are physically able to organize, and physically able to do all that is done.
Yeah, but the question is, how do you get that? Do you get that about confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you're asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence. Without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like those reactions. If you are a black person who live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman. I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a quote militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment someone we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the would make statements like, niggas have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the four young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all three of them. My mother taught one of them in a class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
Can I go back? So this woman, I don't know if you all know this, but Tupac's mom was actually a Black Panther. Yeah. And so that's her on the bottom middle there. I thought that was pretty cool.
Okay, so the Black Panthers are pretty well known for their social programs. Stanford University listed that they had 65 different social programs from the time of 1966 all the way until 1982. I'm obviously not going to list all of them because there are so many, anywhere from the local level to the international level or the national level. But I'll just list some of the ones that caught my attention or are pretty well known. So this one started sometime in the late 60s. I got a couple different dates, either in 68 or 69. And it was their most famous program, and this is the free breakfast program, which is where they would feed needy school children in San Francisco and Oakland, and it also eventually expanded to 19 different cities across the nation. And it was a full breakfast. I think it included bacon, grits, toast, and eggs. And over 20,000 children were fed daily because of this program. They also had a program where they would work with black men in order to prevent their involvement in the Vietnam War and other world wars. So they would host anti-war rallies. They would encourage black men to resist the draft and resist the Vietnam War. And they would also support these resistors of the draft. Another program was their free health clinics. These were in 13 different cities. And they basically gave medical services like cancer screenings and polio vaccines and other immunizations to different people in the communities that needed them for free. And this program was mostly implemented by women who then a lot of times would go on to be professionals in the medical field. There was a program called SAFE, which is Seniors Against a Fearful Environment. And this was specific to the Oakland community, one specific Oakland community. And it was a senior living complex, and basically they wanted to provide, or they did provide, free transportation to seniors within this complex around Oakland to prevent them from being mugged, especially when cashing or getting their pension checks or their Social Security checks. The free food program, which is depicted in the picture to the right, the People's Free Food Program, was for different black and other oppressed peoples to get free food, basically, so it provided an ongoing food supply for these people to meet daily and weekly needs. And then they also had periodic mass distributions of food in order to reach more people that their daily and weekly program did not reach. They had a pretty famous school called the Intercommunal Youth Institute. I think it's now called the Oakland Community School, I think it's still going. But yeah, the school was started in 1971, and the first graduating class graduated in '74, I believe. And at that graduation, the California governor at the time came and gave the commencement speech, and in it he said that the education that the Intercommunal Youth Institute gave was the highest elementary education standard in the state of California, actually. So they were pretty successful on that front. And then another thing they were pretty well known for was their Black Panther newspaper. This would come out once a week, and it provided different news and information on the Black Panther Party's work around the U.S. and the world. It would also provide news and news analysis of Black and other oppressed communities in the U.S., Africa, and other places around the world. There would be theoretical writings and ideological writings of different people in the party. Who was the man who was mainly ideological in one of yours? Bobby Seale was one of these writers oftentimes. And then they also had different kinds of news features every week on the liberation of people from all over the world out of any sort of oppression. So a pretty broad sweep with their paper. Some groups, including the U.S. and the FBI, I guess classified this paper as propaganda. Sometimes it also, though, provided really good news on what's happening within the community and what was happening around the world with these different oppressed peoples. Okay, and then COINTELPRO is something you guys have probably all heard of to some extent. It stands for the Counterintelligence Program of the FBI. And at the time, J. Edgar Hoover headed the FBI, and basically the FBI was afraid of the Black Panther Party because of its Marxist and communist leanings, and also because of its anti-racism agenda that threatened the structure of the U.S. that served mainly white people. And they wanted to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, destroy, and basically overall neutralize what they called Black nationalist hate groups. And Hoover, like it was mentioned earlier, said that the Black Panther Party was, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. So they acted quickly to try to dismantle and neutralize the Black Panther Party. They worked to create and sustain violence among Panthers, as well as among Panthers and other organizations, and they would take advantage of tension or violence that was already there. So for example, Ron, or I think Maulana Karenga is what he goes by now, had an organization called the US organization. Ideologically, they conflicted in some ways with the Black Panthers, and at one point, January 1969, at UCLA, the Black Panther Party and the US organization were competing for the right to advise the selection process of the director of the African American Studies program there at UCLA. And two members of the US organization gunned down, shot and killed two Black Panthers named John Huggins and Bunchy Carter because of this competition to advise the committee and just the overall tension that existed between the two groups. And COINTELPRO immediately took advantage of this violence, and they contrived cartoons and flyers that played on the deaths of Huggins and Carter, as seen in this cartoon right here. It says, if you can't read it, this is Ron Karenga, the head of the US organization, who shot and killed John Huggins and Bunchy Carter. It says, things to do today: John Huggins, check; Bunchy Carter, check; Bobby Seale, and then I can't read that. I don't know what that actually says. But anyway, so they took advantage of this violence with contriving cartoons and flyers and letters playing on these deaths. And like I said, letters were really big. there were lots of anonymous letters that were sent, for example, to Eldridge Cleaver when he was in Algiers, accusing the Panthers in California of plotting against him. So they're really trying to divide the organization from within, and divide the leadership especially. Another follow-up letter was sent, contrived by COINTELPRO and sent to David Hillard, who was the chief of staff of the Black Panther Party at the time, saying that Eldridge Cleaver was becoming unbalanced and mentally unstable. And there were plenty of other letters that were staged between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver trying to get them, I guess, to clash in some way. And then the tipping point of this all was, well, for Cleaver at least, was when another letter was contrived saying that Eldridge Cleaver planned to assassinate Huey Newton's brother, Melvin Newton, and that, like I said, was the tipping point, and Cleaver was expelled from the party after that. And pretty much starting in the early 70s, and then kind of throughout, and then into the very early 80s, the party slowly dismantled and more or less died. Oh, sorry, just really quick. That right there is a letter, or yeah, I guess a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, talking about how they can capitalize upon the violence and differences of the Black Panther Party and the US organization, as well as to exploit all avenues. And it's just kind of crazy. It says it exactly how they're going to dismantle this, and there are other letters online that talk about getting people to turn against each other and contriving letters and things.
So when we talk about the benefits and drawbacks of organizations like the Black Panthers, and with the Panthers specifically, some of the strengths are definitely, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, the major influences that the group had on activism that's happening today and different groups that are present in America right now. And like we've talked about in previous slides, just the audience they were able to reach, and the number of people they were able to help through social outreach, through their free food programs, and political activism, more or less some pretty progressive views on women and giving Black women a platform within their movement, and allowing them to kind of take charge of the image that they had in American society and use it as a point to empower themselves, as well as how quickly the movement grew. If you look at in terms of other social movements and how quickly their membership increased. When it comes to weaknesses, one of the really big standout things I think with how the party sort of crumbled is the time period that this was all happening, because we tend to think about like the Red Scare is kind of only happening in the 50s and this staunch anti-communism is only happening in the 50s. But when the government addressed like this communist rhetoric that was associated with the Black Panthers, and how J. Edgar Hoover portrayed that kind of in his mission to take down the party, it's a pretty detrimental time period to kind of align with that ideology, it seems. And like you see here, like circulating Mao's little red book, and there's also a lot of controversy with individual members and their roles in communicating with established communist leaders around the world. There's a lot of controversy surrounding that, and also the time period where you have this other Reformation movement kind of like peace and love, and especially like white communities that were presenting that ideology in anti-war protesting and civil rights protesting. This is a really different ideology, even though it tends to be not talked about in context like Angela Davis was talking about in the video we just watched. We tend to ignore the context in which violence happens oftentimes. And also, like, because of the government's portrayal of the Black Panthers, like something we found is it's hard to do research on this group and not find stuff that's really influenced by like government perspectives specifically on communism, even though there was a lot more to the group than that partial ideology. And so the way we talk about this group today is kind of clouded by government perspective.
So a little bit about long-term impact of the Black Panthers. One thing is Black Panther as a comic book and as a movie is becoming really, really popular right now. One thing I'd like to make clear is that the name Black Panther for the comic book came out in July of 1966, and then the name Black Panther Party came out in October of 1966. So they are not in any way connected, but I think because that is such it's a common misconception that they are, so common that they have become connected in modern day context. I think the Black Panther comic book series just got taken over by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's going to be using the comic book for a lot of representation for young Black people. And I think that he's drawing a lot from some of the ideas that the Black Panthers had, especially because it's such a youth-directed thing. Also, the movie that just came out recently has a lot of images that are taken directly from the Black Panther Party. The picture of Huey Newton where he's sitting in that wicker chair, they have a very similar type chair that is the throne of Wakanda. And a lot of the outfits that they wear, the way that they've styled the movie, definitely takes a lot of influence from the Black Panther Party. But instead of shining a negative light on it, it's an extremely positive light. And also, Ta-Nehisi Coates' involvement with the Black Panther series, it was just announced at South by Southwest on Saturday that he's also going to take over writing for Captain America. So it is giving him and just black superhero writers, a ton of exposure. I think Black Panther Party has part to do with that. I also want to talk about this documentary. That's the poster for it. It's called The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. It came out in 2015, and I think it's a really good, historically accurate account of what actually happened. And I think that as time goes on and we are farther away from the misinformation that was provided by our own government, more stories like that are coming out, and it shines a light on the Black Panthers as a revolutionary movement, but one that wasn't the stereotypes that so many people place on it now. I think that misinformation is clearing up through movies like that and other forms. And the biggest impact that you can see of the Black Panthers today, I would say, would be living in the Black Lives Matter movement. Although not a lot of people make the direct connection between the two political movements, the ideologies are very similar, especially when it comes to the point of immediate end to police brutality and the murder of Black people. That was one of the main points for the Black Panthers. That is the main point for Black Lives Matter. They use a lot of the same imagery, a lot of the same kind of rhetoric, a lot of the same organizing strategies. They went over the press in much of the same way by creating a similar image. And they are also shining a light on police brutality in very similar ways. The Black Panthers use their newspaper to show illustration and pictures of police brutality, and Black Lives Matter uses cell phones, the internet, but it's basically the same concept. And you can definitely see the influence there. I would say that the main difference between the Black Lives Matter and the Black Panthers is just that Black Lives Matter definitely has a platform of nonviolent protest that they try to really push, and they don't necessarily want to be associated with armed resistance. And that's my impact slide. But Black Panthers are really, really complicated and really difficult to understand even for us after researching them for a really long time. So questions and discussion are definitely encouraged right now.
Did you learn anything about how they funded some of their projects?
Yeah. It was a lot of it was through the newspaper that they sold or through the little red books that they would sell, community donations, but most of it came from the newspaper and literature that they would sell.
Yeah, the newspaper was 25 cents a piece. That a lot. Any other questions?
So, I would assume that a lot of the primary sources and news reports at the time are biased and color the Black Panthers in a very negative light. So in doing research, how do you think it would be possible to compensate for that and kind of really get to the truth of what they stood for and how they enacted their policies?
It's a
It was
really
challenging.
it's a really difficult question because it's difficult to access primary sources in a way, like specifically related to the Black Panthers, especially when it comes to legal coverage. A lot of members of the Black Panther Party were faced with legal charges, leadership and people who weren't in direct leadership positions. And you can get a lot of information from people like Angela Davis and Bobby Seale, people who were in these more direct positions of power. But that's kind of difficult to talk about too, because these people in the present day that are still alive have agendas in different places also, and that brings more controversy. So it's kind of hard to answer.
It's actually a book written, I believe the title is Imprisoned in the Luminous Glare, that talks specifically about the co-creation of the Black Panthers and the media sensation as they fed off each other. The Black Panthers were very adept at using press to advance their agenda, and the press was fascinated with them and made them larger than life. I mean, a 2,000 member organization is not that big of an organization, but their footprint nationally was several orders of magnitude larger than what that membership number would indicate.
This is just kind of a comment that I thought of while you were presenting, but off of just what was just said about 2,000 members made me think of it. Thinking about revolutionary moments or movements in our recent present, I think can feel depressing and feel like not a lot has come of them. But I recently read this quote that was talking about how, revolutionary this movement is and the feminist movement, and they changed so many ideas and they presented this so much possibility.
Yeah.
And like you said, changed what the face of organizing looks like today.
Yeah. I think one of the things while researching that I definitely thought multiple times was that the FBI definitely did have reason to fear the Black Panther Party, because they were revolutionaries and their goal was to overthrow the current state of the US government. And if they had continued doing what they did in the early days of their organization, I think that they could have been to some degree successful in doing that. So the FBI in some way probably, if they didn't want the US government to be overthrown as it was, had to take action. Whether or not you agree with that is kind of a more personal opinion on whether or not the US government should have been as it was in the 1960s and 70s. So, yeah.
Say more about why you think they had to take action. What does that mean?
I think that in their minds they had to take action because if not, I think the Black Panther Party would have been successful in their goals of overthrowing some of the systems that they saw in the US government, and that they were gaining momentum towards achieving those goals, especially. And I think that they probably would have been able to do it for a large part non-violently, because that's where the party was heading, was more towards social programs and education and talking to broad-based coalitions of people, talking to poor white people and Latino communities and people who have been criminalized by their own government. They were really branching out at the time where things started to go to hell, and it was mostly because of the FBI that things were derailed at that point.
Well, and not to mention, like, as an organization, of course, the FBI would want to cover up injustices towards marginalized communities. Like, of course, they wouldn't want material circulating talking about Black people specifically being victimized by police and this really rampant violence that was happening.
Yeah, this stuff like actively benefited the U.S. government, and also with the Black Panthers' Marxist ideals. Like, that is exactly what the U.S. at the time, and definitely still now, is like really not wanting to push, because capitalism and the system that it sets up around the world, with the global market economy, like directly benefits the U.S. economy by taking advantage of, more poor countries, so to speak, and I guess the legacy of colonization. So the Black Panther Party, with their Marxist ideals, were directly threatening the way that the U.S. stays on top economically. I'm curious to know what you guys think about the whole idea of nonviolent resistance and violent resistance, because like self-defense, I think, was something that the Black Panthers really, really focused on. They were called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense for quite a while in the beginning. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think I could say it better than Angela Davis did, but I guess like the main thing that I always say about that is like nonviolent resistance assumes that everybody has like equal access to the table and like equal, right? Like that's, you know, if we get to a point, then maybe we could talk about nonviolence and like politeness or whatever other sort of like Western norms we impose on people. But I think like right now that's an unfair, like unrealistic expectation, exactly like she was saying. So.
Yeah, when the government and police and I guess white communities in general are targeting you actively.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you stand up for yourself, self-defend, I guess?
From a personal standpoint, and I feel as if true revolution won't exactly start until violence occurs. And I'm not saying that like we should all just be like warmongers and stuff, but I like look at the creation of our country during the Revolutionary War and even our Civil War, where like people were like, I don't want to be part of this country, and they tried to break up to, you know, support slavery, the South did and stuff. And then you look at the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, where like these incidents like really occurred, and they changed how those countries function. Sorry, I need to like formulate this a little bit more. I'm like losing my mind too.
Well, while you're thinking that, I will make a slight historical correction. There is a connection between the Black Panther comic strip and the Black Panther Party. Lowndes County, Alabama, had a Black Panther Party prior to both of those organizations emerging, and that's where the name first was popularized.
Okay.
It's a great book called Bloody Lowndes that traces the history of the development of that party. Stokely Carmichael, who later became involved with the Black Panthers, it was a short period of time, as you know, was one of the major organizers of that effort. So they chose the Black Panthers there, and that's what popularized it to get the attention elsewhere.
Okay. Because for some reason, it must be just because the movie and comic is really popular right now. Like, I read a couple of articles and they're like, nobody knows where the name came from, which I'm like, I don't think that's true.
We actually do know.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm sorry, Tahir, did you want to continue?
All right. Like I was saying, I don't necessarily believe that like true revolution will occur until we get to that point to where violence is necessary. And the reason why I say that is because if we look at the civil rights movement, It was, for the most part, a nonviolent approach. However, it didn't, it made things a little bit better, but it didn't address the actual problem, which was white supremacy. So we still have that. So you have massive incarceration rates in communities of color. And even now, like, you know, with the Black Lives Matter and the rampant police brutality towards communities of color, I don't necessarily believe that things will change until violence becomes the answer. And that's just my thinking.
I would agree with that, and I think that that Weber quote that I put up there works really well with that, in that the civil rights, like MLK, the nonviolent resistance that was happening at that time, was very much focused on broadcasting the violence that the state was perpetuating. And so they broadcasted that violence rather than violence of their own. But I think that that's true. I think that some form of violence has historically always occurred.
Like repackaging violence. Just, that's interesting.
I also, sorry.
No, go for it.
I also think that we have to examine violence from white people, and I think Angela Davis touched on this as well. But when there are peaceable movements or people trying to resist, there is a history of the government and white groups violently oppressing the other groups. And so how are you supposed to combat that without violence? So it's thinking about it coming from both sides consistently. And so you have the Black Panthers movement who were experiencing police brutality, and so their solution, or one of their solutions, was having people follow the police to try and hold them accountable, and imposing that kind of threat or level of intimidation that the police were possessing over people of color. So I just think it's really interesting. Sometimes we really focus on violence from the perspective of people of color or minority groups, but we often omit violence from the oppressors.
Which has been like so rampant
Yeah.
and common.
And we like to minimalize it even in today's society, with all the police brutality that's taking place.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to think about with the pictures of the police patrol is like a line of black people with shotguns watching the police arrest someone. And I'm like, what if that's how we dealt with like the Black Lives Matter stuff? Like, one, it probably wouldn't work because that wouldn't happen. But it would just be kind of crazy to see any group of people openly carrying in front of the police while the police is trying to make an arrest. Like, it's a very powerful image to look at. And you kind of question, why isn't that okay? Like, they're truly there to serve and protect.
And on that question, we're going to need to move forward. So a round of applause for our Black Panther presenters. If you can turn off the recorder, we will then move forward with our, just press the